Okay, juniors, we're going to start talking about our last unit here of U.S. history, and we're going to focus on modern presidencies. So we're going to talk a little bit here from the late 1960s all the way up to the Obama administration of the later 2000s, of the 2010s, I guess we would say. So starting with President Nixon, we've already talked about him a little bit when we covered the Cold War and we covered Vietnam. But President Nixon is going to serve as president from 1969 to 1974. He is elected to two presidential terms, the first one in 1968, second one in 1972, and then he is going to resign, year and a half into his second term, okay? But Nixon really represented what was called the rise of conservatism and the conservative movement of the late 1960s and of the early 1970s. And what this movement called for was, quote unquote, reducing the size of the federal government, cutting some of the government agencies, cutting federal government spending, and ultimately trying to give more power back to the U.S. states and what Nixon called himself new federalism. New federalism, the idea of giving power or more power to the individual U.S. states to kind of make their own laws and do things like that. Federalism itself is defined as the split in powers between our federal government and our state governments. New federalism, the concept that the states should receive more power back from the federal government. The federal government at this point in time had kind of been thought of as being overly powerful, I guess, and making too many laws, and the states were kind of losing some of their say so. So what Nixon called new federalism called for giving some federal power back to the states, and this was kind of the start of this conservative era. Again, generally the more conservative were those who were more apt or more supportive of the Vietnam War and using like military action and that sort of thing during this time as well. Some of the things that Nixon dealt with outside of like Cold War, Vietnam War, obviously, I guess the anti-war movement that was kind of led by the more so the new left or the more so liberal movement. That was something he had to deal with, and ultimately kind of the politics of war and the public perception of the war. Other things, again, in the 1970s, we start to see before we talk about economics, we got to talk about Supreme Court. Nixon also aimed to make the Supreme Court more conservative. He felt that the Supreme Court had become too liberal in the 1970s. You're going to see like the Roe v. Wade decision having to do with abortion and that sort of thing. And the conservatives were generally not in favor of some of those social reforms. Okay, so Nixon aimed to add more conservative justices to the Supreme Court to kind of alter the landscape of the United States and try to make the United States more of a conservative country. So in the early 1970s, we're going to experience a variety of economic issues. A lot of them kind of go back to inflation, unemployment, where we're going to see rising inflation and rising unemployment. So again, following World War II, the United States had probably experienced some of the most economic growth, or the biggest period of economic growth in our nation's history, really from the end of the war all the way into the 1970s, and then comes Vietnam and some of those things. But the stagflation kind of refers to a prolonged period of economic, I don't want to say decrease, but definitely not economic growth, where the economy was just kind of like bleh, right? We had rising inflation, rising unemployment, things that are not generally good. And a lot of that kind of went back to oil and such. The United States at this time, we relied on the Middle East a lot for our oil. That kind of led to some issues. We see rising interest rates, and again, the conservative presidents like Nixon tried to, limit how much money was in circulation by raising interest rates. And that was something that maybe backfired, at least at this point in time. But a little bit more about Nixon and his economic policy. And then again, what Nixon is probably most well known for is the Watergate scandal. Going back to the election of 1972, Nixon was a very paranoid individual, very ambitious, but also very paranoid. And in 1972, during that presidential election in which he ran against George McGovern of South Dakota, there was some information that kind of leaked that that he may have had some involvement in covering up a break-in at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The Watergate Hotel is where the Democrat National Convention, the head of the Democrat Party, where the Democrat Party kind of kept all of its information and such. And Nixon, it was proven that Nixon maybe had something to do about it, that maybe he commissioned it, the wiretapping of phones and that sort of thing. Again, Nixon was somebody who was known to have kept a log of who his political enemies were, and he wanted to, stop at nothing to kind of end them. And again, Nixon also wanted to serve another term as president. So amidst all of this, and again, we could teach an entire, year, I feel like, on the Watergate scandal, but eventually what does happen is the House is going to draw up articles of impeachment against Nixon for obstruction of justice, a variety of different obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and lying to Congress. And he would have been impeached, and he would have been probably removed from office. But before any of that can happen, he resigns. So like the day after the House had voted to impeach him, Nixon's going to resign in August. I think it was August 8th, 1974, before he gets impeached. Gerald Ford's going to replace him. Gerald Ford was Nixon's second vice president, and we'll talk more about him here in the next slide. But this Watergate scandal, if it does anything, again, probably one of the greatest political scandals in U.S. history. And if it does anything, it only kind of added to the public conception of our political officials being kind of corrupt individuals, and it makes the public even more cynical than it already had been. Questioning, if our governmental leaders were actually out to do, the good things, right things, right? So again, Gerald Ford will replace Nixon. Gerald Ford, the first and only president in U.S. history to serve as president and vice president of the United States without ever being elected to either of the positions by the people. He had been Speaker of the House during Nixon's first term and a part of his second term. Nixon's first vice president, the guy's name was Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew resigned kind of amidst the whole Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford then becomes the vice president, and then when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became the president. So kind of an interesting thing there. But one of the very first things that Gerald Ford is going to do is he's actually going to pardon Richard Nixon. So impeachment charges are not criminal in nature, but the FBI was prepared to charge Richard Nixon with federal crimes for his role in the Watergate scandal. And one of the powers the president has is the power to pardon, to forgive somebody or to drop charges in pretty much any case or any case in the United States. And so one of the very first things that Gerald Ford did was he actually pardons Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon never got charged with any crimes. After that, he didn't serve any jail time. It was just a done deal. So again, after that, we have the ongoing Vietnam conflict. Eventually, the troops are going to get pulled out of Vietnam during Ford's administration or during his time as president in 1975. But one of the other things that Ford had to deal with again was inflation, and that was kind of a big problem in the mid 1970s, and gas shortages and all these other things. And Gerald Ford was known for his speech. We have to whip inflation in the butt. And his one big policy was called WIN, or Whip Inflation Now. And basically what it called for was the American public, or the United States, cutting back on their oil and natural gas usage. It kind of bombed. It didn't really work out. And again, as a conservative, one of the things at this time that the Republican Party was, priding themselves in was reducing government spending. Okay, and that was reducing government spending. But at this time, you have a rising unemployment rate, you have and some of those things. And so eventually what Ford does is he kind of bites the bullet a little bit, and he's going to sign this stimulus bill that upped government spending and cut taxes with the idea of stimulating the economy. Again, it leads to some deficit spending. And that's kind of what we see here. It's a theme of the time, I guess. And eventually that does lead to a period of time where we're going to see a decrease in inflation and a decrease in unemployment kind of going into the later 70s, which, provided the American people with some hope. Now, again, by this time of 1978, when Ford is going to be up for re-election, he's going to get nominated. The American public, they want some economic turnaround. And so the Republican Party had kind of fallen out of favor with the public. So in that election year of 1976, Jimmy Carter, Democrat from Georgia, not a well-known politician. He'd only served as governor of Georgia, but he is going to run. He's going to win a very tight race with Gerald Ford, and he is going to get elected president in 1976, taking office in 1977. Jimmy Carter is going to serve one presidential term. And again, he same period of time, Cold War, end of Vietnam. We've talked about him a little bit with the Cold War and some of maybe the backwards progress that took place with the Soviet Union. But as far as his domestic policies on, fiscal stance and other things going on, Jimmy Carter was, a peanut farmer from Georgia, and he wanted to focus on bettering the United States environment and focus really on this energy crisis. So and he really, didn't get along with Congress. They kind of went back and forth a lot, but something that they were able to get done was what's called the National Energy Act, which placed a higher tax on gas-guzzling vehicles that use more gas, and provided tax breaks for businesses that found alternative energy resources like solar power or wind energy or things like that. And that was kind of his way of trying to clean up the energy crisis. However, in the later 70s, we're going to see more issues with inflation and fuel shortages and unemployment. And a lot of that kind of goes back to the Middle East and some of the things that were happening there, some of the ongoing conflicts. Now, if there was something that Jimmy Carter got done that was very positive, it was that he kind of helped negotiate what are referred to as the Camp David Accords, where again, the nation of Israel that was created for, as a safe haven for Jews. Again, there was a lot of Middle Eastern nations still to this day that didn't view Israel as being legitimate. One of those countries was Egypt. Israel and Egypt had, clashed, many of times, especially in the late 60s. And again, that's kind of the area of the world where we have oil coming out of. And again, if things aren't good there, that could have affected the United States with oil, and it did. So one of the things that Jimmy Carter did is he invited the leaders of Israel and Egypt to Camp David. Camp David is like the presidential vacation retreat in Maryland. And between him, the leader of Israel, and the leader of Egypt, Israel and Egypt were able to work out a peace agreement. And that kind of made things nice. And that was kind of, probably one of Jimmy Carter's biggest wins as president. Now, that's pretty much right when he gets elected, 1977. Now, in 1979, maybe one of the bigger issues he's going to face with the Middle East is the Iranian hostage crisis. A leader of Israel, the Shah, is what they call him, the Shah. There was a Iranian revolution where Ayatollah Khomeini had kind of, led this revolution in Iran to overthrow the Shah. The Shah eventually is going to retreat, and Jimmy Carter is going to welcome the Shah to the United States to receive cancer treatments. While the people of Iran did not like the Shah, they wanted him returned so that he could face criminal charges for alleged wrongdoings. Jimmy Carter did not, return, or force the Shah to return to Iran. So then what happens in 1979 is at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, the city of Tehran, the embassy is going to get overran. 52 Americans are going to be held hostage by some Iranian terrorists, rebels, for over a year. When Jimmy Carter, is defeated in the presidential election of 1980 by Ronald Reagan, shortly after the start of the new year in 1981, all 52 American hostages are going to be released. And again, that kind of eased some of the tension. But while all this was going on in the Middle East, that led to some issues with, fuel prices and fuel shortages. And it also contributed to issues like unemployment and inflation that are also not good things. So President Ronald Reagan will get elected in the 1980s, another conservative president, and his administration is going to aim to clean up some of the economic issues being faced by the United States during this time.